Chapter 18. The Power of the Three. The cold air in the courtroom-like council room had me uneasy, and if I was feeling this way, I could only imagine what Eve was going through. Everyone was sitting on pins and needles as well. Pete and Cy sat on opposite sides of me, with Sam sitting next to Cy. Jacob, Uriah, Danielle, and Luke sat in the pew behind us. The place, like everything in the heaven realm, was pearly white with statues of important figures littered around the courtroom. If I wasn't there under such bad circumstances, I would probably have taken the time to enjoy a tour of the place. The council sat, discussing among themselves as the atmosphere on the court had become unstable. "The prospect knowingly challenged using deceit and malice," said Councilman Uriel. "And normally that is not only grounds for a forfeit, but it is usually ground for the prospect to be disqualified and taken out of consideration for admittance into the Light Guard Academy." "This guy is so annoying," Pete added, shaking his head, frustrated. I turned to Eve, not wanting to think about what the councilman's words could mean for our legion. I strummed my fingers on the pew as we sat behind Eve. Cy leaned forward. I know a part of her wanted to jump over the barricade and give Eve a huge hug. As it was, she just sat biting the nail on her thumb with a worried look on her face. "Hold off, Councilman Uriel," Abdiel added. "Yeah, let's not make this personal attack on this council," added Councilman Mikkel. The air around the room was thick. Eve stood, gun-shy, watching as the councilman argued back and forth. Maxiel stood defenseless. I couldn't imagine what his defense for Eve could be. What could he say? Eve had stated it on live broadcast. There was no going back. The rest of us were on pins and needles as the men decided whether to forfeit the match and make our already unsurmountable chances worse. "Why?" said Kiel Landon. "The circumstances are obvious. The girl intentionally misled the council so that she would have the opportunity to settle a vendetta. If that isn't the letter of the law, nothing is." "Yes, that may be true, but there are circumstances surrounding the situation that must be considered," added Councilman Milingiel. He pointed in Eve's direction like a prosecutor laying into a defendant. He wore a robe that made him look like a heavenly vampire. He wore a high, eccentric collar that looked like a Vegas show guy. His hair was slicked back in a horrible attempt to make himself look prestigious. He looked so cheesy. Any other time I would have normally cracked up from the sight of him, but I ignored it, more focused on the conflict at hand. I was overtaken by the tensions of the situation. "This guy's a clown," cut Zek, chuckling. "Yeah, a clown," Joe seconded. Landon stared back at me with a look that was usually reserved for my teachers when they chewed me out, but the look was way more forceful. "I am surprised we're not considering throwing the entire Legion out," Landon continued. "It surprises me that a council as prestigious as this one continues to allow these Earthborns to ignore our customs and rules. It's disappointing to say the least." His words caused a stir among our Legion. I sat quietly as the rest of the team whispered disparaging remarks under their breath. As brazen as he was in his critique, there was a sting of truth to his words. I mean, we were far from the most respectful guest in regards to following the rules and regulations, showing up to meetings late, being unprepared, constantly breaking protocol and procedure. Honestly, we were literally the only Legion which has had a non-competing prospect physically attempt to intervene in nearly every single match. "Is this guy serious?" Luke added. "Shh," Danielle ordered, covering her lips with her finger. "You have to admit he has a point." "Well, yeah, but he doesn't have to be a jerk about it," Luke objected. Cy shot an objecting glare before Jacob seconded Danielle's sentiment. "Have some respect for this council and for me," Landon replied, turning to us. His expression took Luke back as he stared at him like he had lost it. This council and your so-called host may allow you to run amok and make spectacles of yourselves, but I will not allow it in my presence. Respect this court and cease your bickering in an official Light Guard Council meeting." We all stared around, looking at each other, not really knowing what to say. He had a point, but once again it was lost in the way it was expressed. Jade turned to him with an angry glare, while Max ignored him, whispering something to Eve discreetly. "Man, this guy is smug," Danielle added via BAU. He smirked before being interrupted by Abdiel. "Seeing as you are so versed on Light Guard etiquette, I shouldn't have to tell you that it's rude and in bad taste to chastise the members of an opposing legion, especially in the presence of what you so generously described as a prestigious council," he fired. "Ha, burn," Sam added, before being elbowed hard by Sai. "Ouch, what?" She shook her head, embarrassed, as Landon cleared his throat, embarrassed. Abdiel continued, sending a covert wink toward me. I smiled, happy to see he didn't agree with Landon, or at the very least, he didn't think the same way. "We're not considering throwing the entire Legion out because there is no precedent or reason for it," Abdiel snapped. "Do not attempt to sully the reputation of this council by assuming we would give anyone preferential achievement. That being said, we are also not going to be biased based on the opinion of an opposing headmaster." The group nodded, pleased by Abdiel's reaction. I was still uneasy as I tapped my feet nervously. Sai placed her hand on my leg, motioning for me to stop. She smiled as I nodded in her direction. "She'll be fine," she replied. "What is with those guys?" I asked Jade via BAU. He sighed and then tried to keep a straight face as he replied. "Landon used to be a council member a while back. Abdiel's position to be exact, but after a while he was voted out by the people. I'm pretty sure you can understand why. Afterwards he started the Alpha House and has actively bumped heads with the council ever since," he replied. "Once again, I'm sure you can understand why." I nodded once more as Landon smiled weirdly, turning to Abdiel. He rubbed me the wrong way. He seemed like he just didn't belong. I stared at the back of his head as he continued smugly. "I just want justice under Light Guard trial law. Nothing more, nothing less," he replied. "As head councilman, I will defer to your judgment." Abdiel turned to Eve with a disappointed look on his face. It seemed like the whole thing was a task he would have rather not have to endure. All in all, he seemed to be on our side, but his hands were tied. It was obvious it wasn't going to end advantageously for us. He shook his head sorrowfully, then turned to Eve as he continued. "Ms. Tamila, in your own words, do you feel you deceived this council in presentation of your motives behind why you challenged Prospect Bahir?" Abdiel replied sternly. Eve looked at all of us sadly, then lowered her head, still wiping the remains of her tears as she continued. It had been almost an hour since she had broken down, but the dried remains of her tears were still visible. I leaned forward, not knowing what she was about to say. I waited impatiently, nervous about what the outcome could be. "Sir, I apologize and ask for forgiveness," she replied, ashamed. "Yes, I apologize, but my angle wasn't to lie or disrespect this council. I was just naive and arrogant. I thought that I could keep my anger toward Prospect Bahir and channel it into beating her, but the truth is, at the time I challenged her, I knew there was a possibility that I could have subconsciously wanted revenge. It was confirmed when I saw her for the first time. I knew then that my anger was the reason. It got the best of me, and I know now why I truly challenged her, no matter what lies I told myself. I purposely ignored those hateful feelings. So, while I did not intentionally lie to this council, I did purposely hide the reservations about my intentions for challenging Prospect Bahir, and for that I apologize, and I ask for your forgiveness." Abdiel sat back with a disturbed look as he looked to his fellow councilman. He had a look that revealed reservations that probably preceded the hearing. At that point, I really didn't care about the trials. Whether she lost or won was inconsequential. I didn't want to lose her. I didn't want Eve to get kicked out. I had grown so attached to her. Now I couldn't imagine being in the Legion without her. Eve, I appreciate your apology, and in this realm, if you ask for forgiveness, it will be given. That aside, Light Guard law is set by Father Yahweh and the Christ. It is absolute. We will convene, then respond accordingly, Abdiel replied with a sympathetic smile. Eve nodded as a huge barrier lowered, restricting access to the council. Eve broke down once more as Maxiel consoled her. Sai and I leaned over the pew, patting her on the back. The rest of the Legion sat on their hands, waiting for a decision. It was minutes, but it seemed like an hour as we sat waiting. The barrier slowly raised, revealing the council. Eve rose along with Maxiel, almost like a defendant waiting on a jury's verdict. I'm sorry for the delay, but we understand the care and thought that must go into this decision, Abdiel replied in an apologetic tone. Eve nodded respectfully, taking a deep breath as he continued. Ms. Tamila, we have come to a decision, he replied. My heart beat fast and my palms were sweaty as I gripped the pew in front of me. It felt like I was on trial. I rocked, dropping my head, almost covering my ears, paranoid about what the outcome would be. Eve once again nodded as he laid things out. We have decided that because you have shown contrition and the ability to thrive in the Light Guard Academy, we will not revoke your prospect status. We will grade you on the ability you showed in your trial, which, if I may say so, was extraordinary, he replied with a staggered smile. Eve returned his smile with an appreciative smile of her own. Abdiel and a few of the other councilmen showcased agreeing smiles before he continued. Unfortunately, it was overshadowed by the malice and deceit you used to showcase it, he continued. That being said, it is with regret that all the cunning and skill you showed will be all for naught, as the match will be forfeited because of the false pretense in which it was propositioned. His words had a two-pronged effect. I was happy to see that Eve wouldn't be disqualified, but to hear that we were now down 3-1 was a letdown. The rest of the Legion seemed to feel the same as they showcased looks of controlled and disappointed gratitude. I raised my head and took a sigh of relief as Eve nodded. That was a relief, Pete whispered in my ear. I nodded in agreement as he continued. Count yourself lucky. If you were a normal Heaven Realm citizen, you would have been disqualified. Luckily, after their discussion, it was decided it would be unfair to hold you to the standard of recruits who have lived and abided in our realm for years, he continued. Taking into account that you are considered young even by Earthrealm standards, it would be unfair to punish you in such a way. But this is a one-time deal. So to the rest of you, this is not only a warning for her, but for all of you. There are consequences for all the decisions you make, and they won't be lenient, so make the right one. We all nodded. With that, everyone said their courtesy goodbyes and headed toward our transport. The media was waiting as the portal door opened. Eve lowered her head as they peppered her with questions. Miss Tamila, will you be answering questions? They all asked in varying ways. This child is in no shape to be answering any questions. She has been given a waiver and will not be doing a post-trial press conference. I apologize, and we will receive the next trial participant on our transport, Jade replied, covering Eve as we maneuvered our way through the fans and media. I finally breathed a sigh of relief as we entered the transport and the door closed behind us. I sat, not really wanting to speak. To be honest, I don't think anyone else did either. My guess was they were all on pins and needles about the next trial. I wasn't, but maybe I should have been, considering how terrible the last two had been. 3-1, it's over, said Zek, tossing his bag. I would have never gotten on this Legion if I'd known we were going to get embarrassed like this. Yeah, it's one thing to lose, but to lose... Before he could speak, Jade motioned for him to stop. Don't say that, he shot. We are far from out of it. Not one of our Doms have fought yet. We have plenty of opportunity to even the score. Exactly, added Max, trying to pep us up. Besides, even if we don't win, it's not the end of the world. All the prospects so far have passed. Tim with an 11, Beth with an 8, and both Pete and Eve with 10s. That is amazing, even if we don't win, and it's also enough for the Legion to qualify. All we need is for one or more of you to get a 7 or higher, and we're gold. Of course, we won't be able to choose our house, but that's all right too. Jacob interrupted, clearing his throat, catching everyone's attention. Well, that would be great, but there's only one problem, Jacob stated, looking out the window. Either we all get in or none of us do, remember? You stated earlier that Sam will more than likely not be an automatic qualifier based off of his showings in our earlier battles. Therefore, if Sam doesn't compete or we don't win, he doesn't get in. Am I right? His words sent a pause throughout our group. We had been so focused on winning the trials that we had completely forgotten about Sam. Well, some of us. Jacob's words sent us all crashing back to earth. I had only been thinking of the competitive advantage of Sam not competing. I never stopped to think about what Max and Jade had explained earlier. Sam had to compete, or we had to win. We all assumed we would win, so we never thought of the consequences of what would happen if we didn't, but now that possibility was a very real one. So much so that I would go as far as saying it looked like the most likely outcome considering our present whole. Everything changed. There was a very real possibility that we had to either drop Sam or decline our invitation to the Light Guard Academy. Yes, that is correct, Jade replied, trying to act confident. But we have the utmost faith in God's plan. Either Sam will be chosen and exceed, or we will win. The faces around the room were looks of shell-shocked individuals. It looked like they were fighting a skeptical dilemma as they stood speechless, especially Sam. He stared out the window as if to be ignoring the conversation entirely. You hear that, Sam? Sai replied, turning to Sam. He nodded, barely moving his head. I'm going to destroy whoever they put in front of me, Sam replied. Watch, you'll see. And when I'm done, you guys will have to admit I'm the best, even better than both my cousins. Then I'll be the best. Not Jacob, not Tim, but me. I'm going to be the first human Ark. I said it and I meant it. I promise. His words were met with politely skeptical looks. I didn't know how to respond, and before I could, my attention was caught by a message that ran across one of the screens on the transport. What? I replied, staring and pointing at the screen at the same time. Turn up the volume. Jade slowly raised the volume as we all watched in awe. In huge letters on a banner across the screen, the letters read, ABA's Lowell challenges Jacob Eli. Were they serious? Was this a joke? They have the competition in the bag, and they challenge our strongest member. I turned to Jacob along with the rest of the group. His eyes went vacant for a second, and then returned. We all knew what had happened without him saying a word. I turned to the screen, dying to hear his score. Well, you are not going to believe this, said Mel, smiling like he was trying to contain his excitement. If the reports I am getting are accurate, this is amazing. We may have an extraordinary bit of news to share with our viewers. He waited for a second, as if to be still getting information via BAU, as we all sat on the edge of our seat for the news that we all pretty much assumed was a given. Yes, it is official. We have just received word that we have indeed just recorded the first ever perfect score, Mel continued. The crowd erupted so loud that we could hear the roar outside of the stadium. The cameras showed close-ups of fans with looks of pure admiration and surprise. On the bus, the feeling was the same. The Legion went bonkers, with Luke jumping all over Jacob as the rest of the Legion's mouths lay on the floor. "Wow!" Zek gleamed, jumping up and down. "Yeah, that is so awesome!" Joe seconded. I looked at Sai as she stared at Jacob like he was an entity from another dimension. "Are you serious?" she added, turning to me and Eve. Danielle shook her head, unable to grasp the reality of what had just happened. "Can't say I'm surprised," Uriah added, patting Jacob. I didn't share in their jubilation. I was paralyzed, realizing a very familiar feeling. It rocked in the pit of my stomach like a violent wave. It was pure anger. I stared out the window, trying to quell the jealous feelings inside of me. After all I had done and all the strides I made, I was back in the shadow of my older brother. How could I ever match something like that? "What were they thinking?" Pete added. "What could possibly be the strategy behind challenging possibly the best prospect ever? All they needed was one more win and Sam was there. I just don't get it." As he spoke, Jade raised his hand, pointing at the television. "I think you're about to get your answer, because a reporter just asked Jacob's challenger Jermel Howell that exact question," he relayed, catching all our attention. The boy looked gun-shy. He was around the same age as me, with frizzy brown hair and brownish red eyes. He stood next to a man who he shared a slight resemblance, although the man had darker hair. From the start, I could deduct this guy didn't seem like the type of guy who was confident enough to take such a risk. His shoulders slouched as he huddled, almost hiding behind his speaking orb. His eyes wandering nervously. "Well, my father and we felt it would be an opportunity for me to show how great the Alpha House is. We want the best, and we fight the best. No easy victories," he replied. "With us having the final 2 challenges, we figured Jacob would be a great opponent to showcase my skill against." The crowd chuckled coldly as he spoke, as one of the reporters spoke up. "I mean, you can't be serious. This isn't just any prospect. This kid is possibly the best prospect we've ever had. You were scored at a 9. There had to be more of a method to your madness other than showcasing your skill, because if that was the case, why wouldn't you put yourself against someone who, in all honesty, you had an actual chance against?" His words seemed to spark an angry reaction as the man next to him sat forward. "Are you insinuating my son doesn't have the ability to beat an Earthborn rookie with no pre-child training?" the man continued. "You can't be serious. This Jacob Eli is extremely talented, but unlike him, my son has been trained by the best trainers in the Heaven Realm. Prospect Eli is extremely talented, but he's also woefully inexperienced. Besides, whether or not my son wins is irrelevant. It is his aim to put on a show to represent the brilliance of the Howell family extends beyond our industrial pursuits." "Who is this guy?" Luke asked, staring at the screen. "Real estate mogul Yusel Howell," Max continued. "His family has owned the largest renovations firm in the Heaven Realm for millenniums. They reside in quadrant Rho Theta Tau Mu Delta Beta." The kid stood like a deer in headlights as his father continued to dig his grave deeper and deeper. I looked over at Jacob, who wore his usual poker face. He was as calm as a cucumber as he sat staring at the screen, emotionless. "I thought there was no money. How can someone be a mogul?" Eve asked, turning to Jade. "Resources are endless, but there is still currency. In the Heaven Realm, it doesn't translate to power or control like it does on Earth, but it does lend itself to prestige and recognition. Howell's family is one of the richest families in the Heaven Realm," Jade explained. "Well, he's acting like a world-class jerk. I mean, it's obvious it wasn't that kid's idea to challenge Jacob, it was his," Sai shot angrily. Jade nodded empathetically. "Be that as it may, it's still a plus for us," Max added. "And after all we've gone through the past couple days, we needed one." I nodded, trying to take as much positive as I could as the transport screeched to a stop. Outside, waiting at the hotel, was a mob. All we could see was a sea of lights, cameras, and people. We all threw on our hoodies like bulletproof vests and prepared to unload off the bus. "Keep your heads down and keep moving," Max ordered.
"Yeah, we have the waiver," Jade continued. "No question needs to be answered. Let's just get to our designated rooms and try to get back to normal."
I nodded, zipping my jacket up. Pop! As soon as I stepped off the bus, light orbs popped, flashing hot light in our faces. They acted like I didn't exist, as they nearly threw me out of the way to get to Jacob. I was the little brother of the town's superstar once more. I covered my head and bullied my way through the crowd as they screamed questions at Jacob. It seemed like forever before we finally ended up back in the hotel lobby. I shook my head, unable to believe the spectacle.
"Jacob, can I have your BAU signature?"
said a voice from behind me. It was another prospect, and I turned around to see another sea of prospects standing in a crowd to greet us as we entered the lobby. It was insane. How big of an achievement was this? We all looked around as the frenzy was at an all-time fever pitch high. "Jacob! Jacob!" The crowd was closing in on us. Jade motioned for us to go to the elevator as he and Max blocked them off. "Please, he has a big day tomorrow," Max explained, blocking off a wall of prospects as we entered the elevator. We all sighed, staring at each other in disbelief as the elevator door closed. "What is going on?" I replied, shaking my head. "When did this turn into a groupie meeting spot?" Sai chuckled. "Well, you heard that Mel guy. This isn't an everyday thing, and here in the Heaven Realm, it's all about experience. It's the one commodity that isn't shared evenly," Danielle explained. "And how many can say they were a part of something that historic? I mean, really?" We nodded, acknowledging her words, still coming down off the roller coaster of events. "So, what's the plan of action?" Uriah continued, focused on the particulars as usual. Uriah stirred for a second, staring down at the sea of people watching him before responding. "I want to train with Tim," he replied, not looking at me as he said the startling statement. Everyone looked at him like he had lost it. I stared at him, trying to understand the selfish motive that I was sure was somewhere in there hidden. "Are you sure?" Luke replied. "No offense to Tim, but he is just a kid. I mean, are you sure you don't want someone who you could somewhat go toe-to-toe with?" Jacob shook his head before Luke could even finish his statement. "No, Tim is the strongest elemental on our team. This guy is supposed to be some hotshot elemental, so Tim can give me an insight on some of the techniques is all," Jacob replied. "Besides, we've sparred enough over the past couple of days." They both nodded in agreement, which I sort of saw as them leaving me out to dry. Didn't I have a say in this equation? The last thing I wanted was to be stuck with Jacob for a night. But as it was, I smiled and tried to act neutral about the situation. Jacob turned, still looking out the window as he leaned against the wall of the elevator. It was going to be a long night. I was tired and a little burnt out. The last thing I wanted to do was spar or do any type of training with Jacob. I shrugged my shoulders and leaned against the back of the elevator, unable to hide the disappointment on my face. "Okay, it's your trial," Luke replied. "How you doing, Eve?" Sai asked. She still appeared to be a little shaken from the day's events. She stood staring out at the sea of people moving about underneath us. "Yeah, I'm just a little embarrassed is all," Eve replied. "I was just so mad." Jacob turned to her with a consoling glance as Danielle put her arm around her. "As pious as we try to be, we're all still human. As Jesus said, we don't battle with flesh and blood, but against principalities. He could have easily said we battle against principles, because those same powers govern our principles of right or wrong. My father always said nothing corrupts free will like justification. We can justify anything, and once it's justified, it's a free ticket to do as we will," he replied, showing a level of care that he never showed to me. Luke joined Jacob, Sai, and Danielle, placing his hand on her shoulder.
Yeah, we're not angry with you, mostly because none of us could say we wouldn't have done the same thing given the opportunity and circumstance, Luke added. So in a way, your actions were a representation of all of us. I think that's why that Abdiel guy responded the way he did.
Eve nodded, acknowledging their words. It was weird to me. To think a little more than a month ago we all barely knew each other, but it seemed like with every day that passed, the bond between us seemed to grow stronger and stronger.
It's still annoying we lost, though, Sam added.
I ignored the conversation, mostly going in and out, alternating between listening and thinking about the annoying task that lay ahead of me. I wasn't looking forward to it. I started to move toward Eve, but before I could, Pete stopped me.
You okay?
Pete shot via BAU. I turned to him with a telling stare before I replied. What do you think? I shot back. I don't want to spar with him. All he's going to do is boss me around and criticize me the whole time. Pete couldn't help but show a playful smile, which he covered by staring down at his feet covertly.
Come on, maybe it won't be so bad. I mean, you got to admit he was pretty cool during your trial, and you have to admit some of the things he says about you are true, he expressed, still doing his best to be non-transparent. I raised an eyebrow at his statement, all but revealing to everyone who was paying attention that I was in a conversation. Luckily, no one was paying attention. They were too focused on Eve to pay attention to either of us. Thanks, I replied, surveying the elevator to make sure. He tapped his foot and looked at the ceiling in a terrible attempt to be transparent. I'm sorry, but you know what I mean, he continued. Tim, you are a highly blessed individual. You always have been, but I'd be lying if I said you don't take advantage of those talents from time to time. Seriously, are you trying to say you really can't understand why he says some of the things he says? I gave him a blank expression without replying. It was obvious he had a point in what he said about me, but let's be serious. He didn't criticize anybody else the way he did me. It was just because I was his little brother, and Pete couldn't understand that plight. He just saw things from a non-emotional, analytical point of view, and everybody agreeing with him constantly cutting me down in front of everyone was starting to run thin. What are you guys talking about? Sai intervened via BAU. Her words literally stopped another tantrum that was going to kill the whole dynamic of the group hug session going on in the elevator at that moment. Is it that obvious? I replied. She covertly cut her eyes, still consoling Eve. Well, not really, but I know you two, she replied. Yeah, that could have been true. But I thought what was more telling was the obvious looks I was giving Pete and the terrible job he was doing of selling the conversation outwardly, but that could have been my paranoia. Well, if you do know us, then you should know what we're talking about, I replied jokingly. Maybe it won't be so bad, she replied. Pete finally looked up at the sound of her words. That's what I said,
he chimed in. As they spoke, the elevator finally stopped on our floor. Everyone stood for an awkward second as the doors of the elevator opened, then slowly filed out. Jacob turned to me just as I moved to exit. Tim, take some time to rest. We'll meet up in an hour or two, he replied. I nodded, narrowly catching his words among the chattering in our BAU. I tried to look as normal as possible as all the faces on the elevator slowly turned to me. Okay, I replied, happy to hear at least we were on the same page about something. As we all exited, Eve hung back. Thanks, you guys, she replied. I'm going to go sit with my sister. I figure if she's anything like Hikari, she'll want to hear about what happened. Sai turned and joined her. Yeah, I'll go with you, she replied, stepping back into the elevator. Me too, Danielle replied, following Sai's lead. They gave awkward smiles as they punched in buttons on the elevator. Okay, we'll see you guys later then, Sam replied. We all waved as the door closed. Before we could turn around, Jacob, Luke, and Uriah had already gone ahead and were heading toward their rooms.
I guess we'll see them later, Pete replied sarcastically. Why are teenagers like that? I mean, they act like since they're older, there's no need to be respectful.
What do you expect? Sam replied. They're probably super nervous about the trials. They're trying to get as much training in as they can. You guys have done it already. You don't have to worry. They're probably just scared, you know? I don't really remember the travel back to our room. It was all a funny haze. We entered our room and, as usual, I headed to my room to sleep. Pete headed for the lab, and Sam headed to the training room. I fell to sleep before my head hit the pillow, once again mentally, physically, and emotionally exhausted. I drifted off instantly. It was a peaceful sleep, but as you can probably guess, it was short-lived. I felt a pulling sensation, then a voice jarred me from my sleep.
Timothy Eli,
said a voice faintly. I awoke to the sound of creaking pipes and dripping water hitting me in the face. I recoiled, shocked, surveying my surroundings. I threw my hands up, annoyed. "Can't I have a moment of peace?" I grunted angrily, slapping the wall next to me. I had done it again, but at least this time my surroundings were familiar. I remembered the place immediately. It was the place I had heard the voices the first time I teleported.
Timothy Eli,
said a voice, catching me off guard. I slid up against a nearby wall. I was so afraid. It took a second for me to realize how stupid it was to be hiding from someone who obviously already knew I was there. "What?" I replied, reaching for a weapon. I had nothing on my hip. I had no armor. I was wearing the same clothing I had on the day I died.
"I mean you no harm, Timothy Eli," said the voice. "Please, I've brought you here to speak with you."
At the sound of his words, I rose and cautiously walked toward the sound of the voice. The halls were slimy and wet. I crept through the hallway, cautiously stepping through the muddy passageway. It looked like something out of a medieval story. "Come with me, Tim," said a familiar voice as I came around the final corner. It was Michael. I couldn't believe it. "Michael?" I replied. "Was that you calling me?" He shook his head as he motioned for me to follow him. "It wasn't me," he replied. "I'm here to make sure everything is on the up and up. We've only done this once before. It was during the Alpha Generation cycle. They chose a man named Enoch. He became the first and only man they've ever asked to speak on their behalf." His words were making me uneasy. Michael was normally so carefree. Now his demeanor was stoic and serious. He led me toward a cell that was surrounded by guardsmen. Michael acknowledged the men as they opened the door and allowed me in. As I entered, what I perceived to be an angel sat bent over at the waist, with his head hanging between his legs.
"Hello, Timothy Eli," he greeted, startling me.
"Hi," I replied, still gun-shy. He slowly raised his head and glared at me with eyes that were as black as coal. I recoiled as he raised his hand, reassuring me he meant no harm.
"How are the Light Guard trials going for you?"
he continued, like we were old friends. Michael stood between us. He spoke with heavy emotional gravity. He sounded defeated in a way that made me feel sorry for him. I moved to respond, but before I could, Michael cut me off. "Semyaza," Michael warned angrily. "Ask him the question so we can get on with this. Like I told you before, I am not at all comfortable with this, so until I can be sure of your motives, I will not allow this meeting to continue." He raised his hand in an apologizing manner as Michael stared darts at him.
"I'm sorry, Michael,"
he continued, raising his hands in a surrendering manner.
"Timothy Eli, do you remember this place?"
I nodded, not knowing the purpose of the question. "Yeah, I think I was here a couple of days ago," I continued, surveying the place as I responded. Michael turned to me. He exhaled in a frustrated manner before placing his hand on his head as he asked a question of his own.
"And when you were here, what happened?"
he asked, staring at me. I stared at him, trying to understand why it was so important. I shrugged my shoulders, expressing a level of ignorance. The man refused to raise his head, and the longer the conversation went, the more off-putting his demeanor was. I answered Michael's words, still wondering why the angel was so apprehensive about showing me his face. I don't know, really. I just remember waking up here. As soon as I got my bearings, I heard voices. 2 people arguing, I replied, turning to Michael to get assurance from him that things would be fine. Michael sighed at the sound of my words.
"What were they talking about?"
he replied. It was like one of them was trying to get the other one to do something, I replied. I was confused by the whole thing. I had no idea what they were talking about. I just heard something about suns and a war. Michael stared at the ceiling like my words were the last thing he wanted to hear, before forcing Semyaza to continue with a point of his finger.
"Was his voice one of the voices you heard?" he asked.
I think so, I replied. His, and I also heard one of the voices call the other voice Semyaza. Michael nodded at the sound of his words, then signaled with the movement of his hand for Semyaza to continue. Semyaza nodded and turned to me.
"Timothy Eli, do you know who I am?"
he replied, looking me in the eye. I turned to Michael for confirmation before continuing. He nodded, giving me the okay. Well, kind of. Max, Hans, and Jade explained a little about you and your legion, I continued. You're the guy who was a part of, or the leader of the Watchers, right? He nodded, acknowledging his words in a manner that showcased a heavy guilt as he rocked back and forth.
"Exactly, that is true," he responded, nodding as he spoke. "I was the head of the legion your people refer to as the Watchers."
I nodded, still somewhat hiding behind Michael, as the angel finally raised his head, showcasing dark black eyes as he spoke. His eyes were like the rebel demons. I backpedaled, causing Michael to place a sturdy hand on my shoulder, calming me.
"I can read your actions, Timothy Eli," he responded. "You're wondering why you came here? You're wondering why you're here talking to me?"
I stared at him without replying, before Michael unsheathed his sword. It seemed to grow on his side from nowhere. "I warned against that form of BAU," Michael responded in a warning grunt. Semyaza raised his hands in a begging manner.
"Michael, I used no form of BAU," he defended, pleading. "I watched Adam's people for hundreds of years. I know how they think. That's all I meant by the statement."
Michael closed his coat, concealing his weapon as it shrunk back to the size of a pouch. He nodded, signaling for him to continue. His demeanor threw me. I had never seen Michael like this before. He was so cold and emotionless with the man. He was uncomfortable for the first time since I met him.
"So, is it true, young Timothy Eli?" he asked, looking me in the eye. "Do you want to know how I got here?"
I looked around the room at the guards, who looked to be terrified as they stood at the gate as if they were worried something could be coming at any moment. I swallowed hard and took a deep breath before nodding my head.
"Great, because it will be a great segue into why you're here," he replied with a smile that put me on edge. "I know you've heard the legends, but I think it's time I told you the true story of the Watchers."
He paused for a second, composing himself before continuing.
"Timothy Eli, in order to explain our story, in a sense, I'll have to first explain your story," he continued.
I furrowed my brow at his statement, unable to fathom what he meant. I looked to Michael, who gave me a calming nod. "What do you mean, my story?" I replied, confused. He chuckled out loud at my naive nature. I stared at him unmoved as he continued.
Well, I know the story of man, he continued, and you're a man, aren't you?
I stopped to analyze the question. Technically, he was right in terms of species, but I had a few people who would fall over themselves to break down every way I fell short, namely my soon-to-be training partner and big brother, Jacob. I guess technically, I replied. He shook his head with another chuckle, as Michael stared at me with a look that tried to bait me with a protecting smile, but I could see he was still worried. His gaze bounced from us back to the entrance, and it made me uneasy.
Well, not a mature man, but you're a man all the same, he replied, smiling. Am I right?
I shrugged my shoulders, then nodded hesitantly. Yeah, I relented.
Well, Adam, your father, he replied.
How do you know my father? I cut in. Michael shook his head, exasperated.
He's not talking about your father, Adam, Tim, he replied,
placing his forehead in his hand. I turned to him, confused by his phrase. Oh, well, what Adam is he talking about? I replied. He stared at me blankly, then sighed.
Take a wild guess, he replied, shaking his head.
Semyaza, can we pick this up? Tim is a very literal and impatient kid. Think about what you say, or circles like this will be a permanent part of our conversation. I stood like a deer in headlights as the two exchanged glances. Michael wore an impatient scowl, while Semyaza nodded in agreement as he continued.
I was referring to the father of man, Adam, the first man. He was a friend of the angels. He was our brother, he replied, staring at Michael as he spoke.
Michael showcased a soft glance just before his face fell to the floor in a sympathetic manner. Semyaza turned to him, seconding his demeanor.
Adam was like our little brother in every sense of the word, he continued. We taught him everything. He was the darling of the heaven realm then. Everything was one. We all knew him. We all knew why Father Yahweh created him. He was the new race. It may sound amazing to a short-lived race like yours, but we angels were used to it. Father Yahweh made new creations all the time. It was nothing out of the ordinary. Every now and then, he'd bring his creations and let us see them. We gushed and were in awe every time he did. Like proud brothers, we were honored to see every new addition to the family. But from the moment we met Adam, we knew he was different.
His words left me wondering as I spoke reflexively without thinking. Why? I replied. What was different? He looked at Michael with a look that made it obvious he was asking for permission. Michael stared away, never making eye contact with Semyaza as he spoke. Well, in short, he was one of us, Michael replied. I'm super confused right now, I replied, surprised by Michael's words. Adam was an angel? Michael turned to me impatiently, sighing unhappily about having to explain something else. No, Tim, he replied, irritated. I just meant he was made in God's image like us. He had the breath of God in him. He was the first creation of his kind. His words piqued my curiosity as I stared at him. Why did that make him special? I asked, confused. I mean, I thought all God's creation had a part of him in them. I turned to Michael as I spoke, but before he could reply, Semyaza broke in. Yes, his light, but not his breath, Timothy Eli, he exclaimed, using his hands for effect. Think about it. What is more powerful than the breath of God? It's his word. So Adam was the first creation to have the ability to speak with the authority of the breath or word of God. Michael stared away once again, his gaze going back to the entrance. It instantly made him the most powerful being in creation, he replied, staring me in the eye. But then he was just a boy. He didn't understand it. To him, he was just our little brother. We all knew there was a special plan for him,
but we never knew what that plan was. All we knew was Father Yahweh was pleased with him and wanted us to watch over him. Even before Adam was created, Father Yahweh decorated his homeworld more beautifully and extravagantly than any homeworld he ever made. It was like watching a proud father creating his son's nursery. He smiled as if to be reminiscing on it. When it was perfect and good, he created Adam. He spent years having Adam name any and everything on the earth, giving him supreme authority over it, making anything he said law. He made every animal male and female, but Adam was alone, he replied, continuing. Adam, being the only one of his kind, wanted someone like him. Father Yahweh heard his words and decided to make him one, but he knew it would be too dangerous to make someone exactly like Adam. Father Yahweh, in his infinite wisdom, knew that there would be conflict, so he decided to make Adam a companion of what your people used to refer to as smokeless fire, or what you know as electricity. But instead of dust like Adam, she was made from the deep soil of the earth. His words led me to an understanding that I deducted within seconds, but like I did with most times, I ended up at the wrong conclusion. Eve was made of light, I blurted. He stared at me with his dark pupils almost squinting in anguish. No, Lilith was, he replied. Lilith was. I stared at Michael, who was already shaking his head in frustration. Who is Lilith? I asked, confused. Michael sighed before turning to Semyaza, who continued. If Eve is the mother of the living on earth, Lilith is the mother of the dead, he continued. She was also a gigantic, bratty, annoying child that was a pain in the butt of every angel that had to watch her. He shook his head in the exact opposite manner to the one he had when thinking of Adam. Why? I continued to press. Well, let's just say she refused to listen to anyone, Semyaza continued. Us, Adam, no one. Michael stared at the entrance as he interrupted. That could have had something to do with the spoiled brat who watched over her, he cut. I turned to him at the sound of his words. Who? I asked. He cut his eyes immediately. Lucifer, he replied. The great deceiver, son of the morning? Please, he's a selfish, petulant child. Michael's face was brimming with disgust that seemed to weigh down his entire demeanor. Wait, Lucifer, as in the devil? I replied. Semyaza nodded as he continued. You never wonder why he was forced from the garden? He continued. Unlike the rest of us, he never agreed with Father Yahweh's decision to make a being like Adam. He actively hated and envied him from the moment he was asked to see him as his superior, mainly because he knew what it meant. He was one of the highest-ranking members in the heaven realm, but the thought that Father Yahweh loved any race more than us infuriated him. And like a child whose father brought home the new baby, he was jealous. Next came the temper tantrum in which he rebelled, taking a third of our brothers with him. He gripped the bed he sat on firmly as he spoke, visually agitated, absorbing his words. Michael stood kicking at the floor with his hands in his pockets. But who am I to speak, right? He replied, turning to Michael. Michael nodded empathetically. But I digress. Lilith, under Lucifer's tutelage, became more and more defiant. When Father Yahweh finally intervened, she fled. Father Yahweh wanted to fill the earth, but before he could allow Lilith and Adam to create seed, she defiled herself with the dark beast of the field, Semyaza continued. I frowned at the thought. Wait, you mean... I replied, disgusted. Semyaza nodded, finishing my thought. Gross! I shot, sickened. That's so gross! Michael chuckled snidely. My thoughts exactly, he seconded. So what happened? I pressed. Well, Adam was obviously upset, he he replied. And Lilith knew that she and Adam could never be together again, but the love she had for Adam never subsided. The two were raised together. It broke her heart to lose Adam. He was the love of her life. She rebelled against all form of control, and she finally went too far. She wasn't clean. She, like Lucifer, couldn't enter the garden, and worst yet, her union created abominations, or what you refer to as demons. She corrupted Father Yahweh's perfect world. Lilith gone and Adam alone, we all knew that something had to be done. Adam was a wreck. He walked around the garden sad, so Father Yahweh decided to create someone he thought would be perfect for Adam.
Eve, I chimed in. Michael stared at me with an inquisitive gaze that led me to believe he got right away why I was so quick to answer the question the way I did. Yes, Eve, he replied. Semyaza stared at us both for a second, then continued.
Eve, unlike Lilith, was made from the very body of Adam. She loved him with a love that we angels never witnessed outside of our love for Father Yahweh, he continued. She was so beautiful and caring. She was like no other being we had ever met. She was a perfect complement for him. Unlike Lilith, she was loyal to him, which made her an obvious target for Lucifer to go after.
His words gave me pause. So, you're saying he, liked Eve? I cut in. He turned his head slowly.
He wanted someone who was loyal to Adam, he replied. Who or what it was, that was inconsequential. It was about taking everything from Adam. He perceived Adam was the reason everything was taken from in his eyes. He wanted retribution. It was his contention that he would test every blessing given to Adam to prove he wasn't more worthy than he was. I'm pretty sure you're familiar with the story.
I nodded, remembering the story that had been told for thousands of years, the story of the fall of man.
That wasn't about taking Eve, it was about taking everything, he continued. Eve was just a means to an end. Unlike Adam, Eve didn't know Lucifer's energy. At the time, she really didn't know about anything. She was left alone, and Lucifer knew she was naive. He targeted her at a time where she was vulnerable. He pretended to be an angel of light. Since Eve didn't know there were bad angels, it was an easy ploy. He knew Adam loved and trusted Eve, so he found a way to control her. It was the only way to get to Adam.
His body tensed up at the sound of Adam. So how? I pressed. I've always wondered about that. He stared me in the eye as he continued.
With doubt, he replied shockingly. Doubt is the father of lies and sin. It's Lucifer's biggest asset, his creation. The fruit he presented brought the ability to decipher free will. Doubt is the only thing that calls for the analysis of right and wrong. It's the catalyst of sin. Think of every sin. Lying, cheating, stealing, lust. It's all based in doubt. Whether it's doubt of loyalty, ability, means, or authority, doubt is the fall of man. Sins are just the fruits of the labor. Money is obtained through stealing, lying, and cheating to control circumstance. Lust built on the back of insecurity is the way we confirm our worth, both physically and emotionally. It all comes from low self-esteem and a lack of faith. Lucifer knew this was the only card he had, and he played it. He took one of the most powerful beings ever created and turned him into a self-conscious, insecure, worry-ridden, anxiety-filled, and faithless mess, with a complement who was worse than him.
Michael shook his head as Semyaza continued.
In that apple was a science. Lucifer created a disease that attacked the physical and spiritual immune system. It was what created the barrier that stymies your abilities and severed you from the heaven realm. It separated the will of the flesh and the will of the spirit, creating an unbalanced divide. The flesh could no longer survive feeding off the spirit. The infused doubt needed to be quenched. Fear, anxiety, and insecurities attacked the flesh through the very same receptors that you now understand controls your faith-based powers. So, of course, Father Yahweh instituted the barrier to prevent Adam's children from destroying themselves. But in doing so, all the things that you once had control over, you now didn't. The world that bowed to him no longer had a master. It became wild and unpredictable. It was filled with as much doubt as Adam was. Lucifer took advantage of this. He met Adam after he was exiled and asked him to give the fallen creation to him. He was an ark and convinced Adam he could control it. Adam gave in mostly because he falsely assumed he would be taken back to the heaven realm eventually. He didn't understand the effect that decision would have on his children. Even if he was gone, his children would have to live in this world. His words angered me. Why? I asked. Why would he do that? He sighed, shrugging his shoulders in a helpless manner. Adam wasn't the same Adam from the heaven realm and Eden. He was filled with doubt, and so was Eve. He and Eve were constantly under attack from Lilith, especially Eve. Lucifer was constantly lying and deceiving Adam, filling him with doubt about Father Yahweh's love for him and unwillingness to protect him. Adam knew this wasn't true, but the doubt in his brain couldn't let him be sure. So, after years of torment, he finally agreed. He said he would lease the planet to Lucifer if he promised to protect Eve from Lilith. The girl was pregnant with his first child. He figured it would allow her to rest while he did penance to gain forgiveness from Father Yahweh. He continued, explaining things. He figured that without Eve, he had a better go at it. She was slowing him down because of her physical weakness. All in all, he accomplished his goal. With the help of the archangels, Father Yahweh forgave Adam and once again allowed us to protect him. Eve returned with her son to meet Father Yahweh from the first time since her exile. I nodded, knowing the significance immediately. Cain, I replied under my breath. He nodded in agreement. Exactly. It was obvious from the moment we came across him that he inherited the disease. We all were saddened as we knew what it meant. This disease was a part of Adam and Eve, and now we knew it would also be a part of their children as well, he continued, annoyed. It was heartbreaking. After a couple more births, we were all but sure that this disease couldn't be cured. It was a very hard time for Adam, who was convinced his seed would forever be cursed. Then they had their next child. Abel, I replied. He looked at me with a smile. Timothy Eli, do you happen to know what that name means? He asked. I shook my head as Michael intervened, answering the question. Breath, a breath, he replied, in saving grace type of tone. He smiled, staring at Michael. Exactly, Semyaza replied excitedly. Exactly. He was the first being since the original Adam. He didn't have the disease. The breath of God, the word of God dwelled within him still, untainted. He was the first light in a decade of darkness. He was the legacy Adam was waiting for. We rejoiced. Adam had hopes of redeeming the new heaven and earth. Throughout the hoopla and circumstance, we all forgot that there was another son. Michael turned to me with an empathetic glare. I'm sure you can empathize with why that would make someone mad, he poked. I nodded as Semyaza continued. Yes, but Father Yahweh was always considerate of Cain, but he understood the monumental task ahead of him. Cain didn't understand this. He couldn't understand why he was always so monitored and not allowed to do things Abel could. Father Yahweh knew Cain had to control his emotions or sin would overtake him, but Cain was too young to understand this, and by the time he became a man, the anger that built inside of him became resentment for his brother. The final straw came when it was decided that Abel would inherit the earth after Adam passed on. Cain was livid, because he was the older brother. He didn't understand the reasoning because he never knew the dangers of sin. He didn't understand why Abel was chosen. He didn't understand what his brother not having the disease meant. He didn't understand Lucifer and his demons could not influence his little brother with doubt. Abel had the ability to protect his sisters from Lucifer, but Cain was filled with anger. He felt he was the only other man. If he got Abel out of the way, then it would be his inheritance. Once again, I'm sure you've heard the story.
His words gave me weird feelings. It was so easy to demonize Cain without understanding the whole story. I could understand the mindset of being forgotten to the point that at times it seems you didn't exist. But what he did put an anger in my stomach that seemed to travel to the pit of me. It was an anger I couldn't understand. So the light or breath of God had once again been extinguished, and the only other man had been soiled with murder. Cain was gone, and Adam and Eve were beyond themselves with worry, even though Cain was covered by the mark of God, Semyaza continued. He was distraught over the death of his brother, but it was done. After his exile, his children filled the earth, and a war began between the children of Cain and the children of Lilith. Adam and Eve watched as the child they once loved created children who fought the armies of Lilith and Lucifer with physical assault, knowing they couldn't harm them, receding them to the dark recesses of the earth, once again claiming the earth for man. Cain returned believing he had redeemed and shown that Father Yahweh had made a mistake in not making him the inheritor, forgetting the very reason he was able to conquer the earth was because of the mark bestowed upon him by Father Yahweh. It was then that he found out his mother was pregnant again. We all rejoiced when we discovered that it was another boy, but our rejoicing slowly dissipated when we discovered he, like Cain, had the disease. My countenance fell at the sound of his words. But something was different about him, he continued. The doubt affected him differently. He had free will and doubt, but he chose to do what was right. It wasn't because he had to. He did it because Father Yahweh said it was the best thing to do. And when Father Yahweh asked him why he chose to listen to him, even though he didn't have to, Seth said, "I was made in your image and you said I should." His words filled not just us, but Father Yahweh with a feeling we hadn't felt since Adam. I could tell their emotion just by the look on their face. It was like remembering an old, good friend. Cain wanted Seth to follow in his footsteps, but he wouldn't. Seth always followed the word of God. When Adam passed on, he left his protected land and inheritance to Seth. Cain was crushed. Unlike Adam and Seth, he wanted to prove Father Yahweh wrong rather than ask for forgiveness. A notion and passion he no doubt got from Lucifer, who revealed to him that it was he who protected him during Eve's labor, not Father Yahweh, he continued. He had Cain convinced that the one thing keeping him from his inheritance was his brother. But Cain refused, stating he would not take another brother's life after the pain of the last time. Lucifer quickly manipulated him into believing his offspring would be the true inheritors, and even though Cain refused, after he passed, his children were not as hard to convince. After his death, they started a war with the children of Seth that waged on centuries. I nodded, trying to remember all the things that were said. He clenched his hands, showing visual disdain that made me uneasy. "That is where my story comes into play," he replied, sighing loudly. "You're talking about the downfall of you and your legion, right?" I asked. He nodded. His eyes no longer filled me with fear, but now gave off a more destitute, distant look. It brought out feelings of sympathy one would get when looking at a blind man. I, like Michael, was trusted to make sure Seth's children weren't wiped out by Cain's offspring. This was mandatory. The war between the two families wasn't even.
Cain's children had learned secrets of war, while Seth's children were peaceful and forest dwellers who wanted to follow Adam's lead. They felt an obligation to protect the earth. Their aim was to restore balance to the planet. They had the ability to fight using the light art, but they weren't killers. They were spiritual people that wanted to save the world, and that included the souls of the children of Cain, he continued. But Cain's children were completely consumed by their desires and gave in to their most carnal instincts. They were warriors. They systematically searched and destroyed all of Seth's children. It got so bad, the children of Seth had to go into hiding to prevent extinction. Sadly, the world wasn't big enough. No matter where we hid them, the children of Cain found them and brutally massacred them. Seth protected them as long as he could, but he realized before he died that Cain's hesitation wouldn't be shared by his children, so he foresaw the fallout that followed Cain's death. He knew running wasn't going to suffice. He, unlike Cain, was there when Adam passed. His words were foreign as I stared, befuddled by his statement. "What do you mean?" I asked, pressing him. He turned to Michael, who once again gave him a permissive nod. "The story that is in your Bible is not the end of Adam and Eve's story," he continued. "Adam was the first being God created that had to die with doubt. So, while on his deathbed, he called all his children and grandchildren together, and for the first time, he had Eve explain who Father Yahweh was and why they were no longer in the garden. He explained why he and Eve were no longer able to travel to the heavenly realm. When he finished, he sent Seth to beg for forgiveness on his behalf and give his father his dying wish of his favorite fruit from the garden. Seth battled all types of beasts and beings to get to the garden, and once there, he spoke with Yahweh and begged on the behalf of his father. Father Yahweh forgave Adam, and upon his death, he was taken to the heaven realm along with Abel. Soon after that, his mother Eve passed on to the heaven realm. They became the first members of the High Council in the human quadrant, but on Earth, me and my group was left in charge of making sure Seth and his family were not destroyed by Cain's family. Each angel in our legion was in charge of a woman, by order of Michael under the advice of Seth. I turned to Michael at the sound of his name. He turned to the entrance in a coy attempt to look away. I turned back to Semyaza, more entrenched into the words he was about to say. "Michael, and Seth to an extent, they trusted us to watch over the women until a boy could be born to wife them, and for a time there wasn't a problem. It worked perfectly until Seth's granddaughter Diana came along," he replied, shaking his head. "Diana?" I questioned. "It sounds so familiar. I've heard that name before." "She is fairly well known as the goddess Diana," he responded, causing me to nod. "She was also known as Rhea, the mother of the most powerful Olympians." Before I could reply, he continued. "She was so beautiful. The only thing close to her was Eve. I never felt attraction before. I didn't understand the pull of the heart. I didn't understand the obsessive thoughts and dominating feelings that arose from such an attraction. She was a wise woman. She understood the effect she had on all men. She was another Lilith. She was supposed to be married several times, but refused. She never felt any man was good enough for her. As she rebelled, she became more and more provocative in her tempting of the Watchers in my legion. As a result, a majority of my legion mates couldn't watch over her because they said she would purposely tempt them. So I was constantly changing her watcher until I finally had to take over myself. Immediately she had me drawn in. Years passed, and we became closer and closer until I was sure for the first time that I was in love with her. I wanted to be with her like Adam was with Eve, and I didn't think that could happen. When I went to excuse myself based on these feelings, several of my legion mates disclosed they were in similar situations. They said, why should these women who are not marrying be by themselves for the rest of their lives? And why shouldn't we be able to have someone to love? He replied in a pleading tone.
Michael turned to him at the sound of his words.
Simple, because you weren't made for that purpose. It wasn't about being alone. It was jealousy and a sense of entitlement. Lucifer may have been more upfront with his feelings, but they were the same as yours. Don't masquerade your feelings as human, because they weren't. You just convinced yourself that you were in love and infatuated with this woman. You weren't. You were jealous, and you took advantage of the trust that was given to you by me and Father Yahweh. Don't sit here sweetening and romancing your motives to Tim, because your actions were equal to pedophilia in my eyes. He fired, showing visual agitation.
Semyaza's face scrunched at the sound of his words. He showcased an anger toward Michael for the first time since I had been there.
Michael, you're so perfect, right? He shot. Who are you to tell me what I feel? Maybe it was jealousy or entitlement, but you left us here to watch over them without ever letting us know the dangers.
Michael shook his head, laughing.
I left you here because I trusted and had faith in you. There was no danger to disclose. The only danger was the danger you created, Michael replied. You knew that sin was a possibility because you were in a world leased by the creator of the very disease. You let your guard down because you were away from Father Yahweh, and let Lucifer lull you and your legion into a false sense of security. You believed that you had the free range to do as you pleased, and you exercised that right. It was you.
Semyaza lowered his head in an ashamed manner.
So what happened? I asked, turning to Michael.
Michael turned to Semyaza as he continued.
I took Diana as my wife, on the word that the others would join taking women as their wives, he replied. But I never understood that the situation was a setup. Lucifer had infiltrated my legion, and it was simply a ploy to corrupt our legion and inevitably Seth's offspring. My legion mates taught their wives light art, creating the first witches. We found and punished them, but we couldn't harm humans. So, the witches began to teach others, creating wizards of the same ilk. Things became worse. These men were not like the women. They began to use these skills in their war with the children of Cain. Seth, who cared about the earth he inherited, understood the effects of using these arts would have on the world.
I stared forward, feeling serendipitous goosebumps on my neck, thinking about the implications.
As you now know, dark arts require sacrifice. Witches and now wizards were sacrificing earth elements, animals, and human blood to attain the light energy they needed to make their spells work, he continued. These spells corrupted their souls, mutating them, mortifying Seth's line along with Cain's, who had long been corrupted by the rebel angels long ago. Then, things became more corrupted. My legion mates began to have children with their wives, creating the hybrid beings you know as Nephilim. These beings were beyond evil. Calling them bullies would be mild. They were almost 2 to 3 times the size of normal men when they reached maturity, and usually learned the dark arts from my Watcher Legion personally. It was hard to keep them in line, but we were able to quell them because they weren't very powerful, because they were the product of lower-level angels. All that considered, they still were able to cause crippling damage to both the children of Cain and children of Seth. They were both targets, but it was manageable enough that the Heaven Realm was unaware. I see it at the time, but I was only seeing the grassroots of their master plan. You see, there were 13 masterclass angels in my legion. I was one of them, and Diana and Lucifer's endgame wasn't to create hybrid beings. Their master plan was to create the next great race. Diana seduced me, and I was the first to have children. I understood they were too powerful to allow out in the world,
So I kept my family from the rest of society, caged away from the world at our Olympus compound. My actions earned me the nickname that would remain. The name Cronus was what I was known as to the people. The name was a term that meant to cut off or keep away. Diana hated this. She wanted them to take their place as the new race, the new leaders of Earth. I explained to her that to do that would put us in direct opposition, because the inheritance of Seth was what I was sworn to protect. Over the years, she had become more and more powerful, learning the dark arts from Lilith and Lucifer to better perpetrate their plan. I was so in love with her, and I trusted her like Adam trusted Eve. I never thought she would ever betray me, but I had no idea she had already forfeited her soul to Lucifer for immortality and to learn the dark arts. She became pregnant and kept this away from me until the child was born. She gave me a subatomic clone while she allowed the real one out into the world. I went utterly blind for the majority of the years, until finally I heard that there was a Nephilim who was more powerful than any the Legion had ever faced. I went to meet him, and I was surprised to not only see him, but the rest of my children as well. They had enslaved the children of Cain, and referred to themselves as the Olympians, named after the compound where I had kept them. With my powerful lineage, faith energy, and Lucifer's subatomic training, they were more than formidable, but that didn't matter to begin with. They were my children. I couldn't fight them. Years passed, and it was no longer Cain's offspring versus Seth's offspring. It was now human versus Nephilim, or as they began to call themselves, gods. Diana had become my nemesis, but by this time there was no way to go back. My brethren had succumbed, creating more and more beings like my children, to the point that they overran the earth. There were more Nephilim than men. I knew the death and destruction that prompted prayers to Father Yahweh would reach back to the heaven realm. I expected a swift reaction. In all actuality, I wanted them to come. I had put myself in such a deep hole, and I had no way out. When Michael finally arrived, I was so relieved that I was willing to accept whatever punishment Michael or Father Yahweh found appropriate. Michael arrested me and my legion, and placed us here because he wanted us to watch as our children destroyed each other. The rest of the story you know. The world needed to be cleansed, so he set aside Noah. He paused, gathering himself. I was still sputtering, confused as to why I needed to hear the story. I didn't get its correlation to me. Hearing how this war between two brothers shaped the world I knew was unsettling. I stared at the enormous guilt at the man's feet, and I found it hard to find sympathy to outweigh the anger that was prompted from the carnage and death that he brought upon my people for some carnal lust. I juggled both emotions as he ran his fingers through his hair before continuing. "So, hearing my words, Timothy Eli, do you pity me?" he said, staring at me. I looked at Michael, who was still staring at the entrance, almost ignoring the conversation before turning back to him. "I don't know," I replied. "I guess what you did was bad. Really bad. But to be honest, I don't know." Before I could finish my words, he interrupted me. "I understand," he replied. "I've only asked one human that question from this very cell over 2 millenniums ago." I turned to him with curiosity. "Who?" I asked, curiosity piqued. "Enoch," he replied. "His name was Enoch. He was my friend. Timothy Eli, do you know who Enoch is?" I shook my head as he continued. "Enoch was a very special man," he explained, smiling exuberantly. "He was like Abel. He was born without the disease, the first one since Abel, but what was more important, he was the man who let us know the secret to the disease Lucifer created. There were always 3. The disease had 3 in every generation." I stepped closer to him. "What do you mean by 3? I replied.
Each generation there are the 3 catalysts. There is a seed of Abel, Cain, and Seth to profit each generation," he continued. "So the disease had a controller of the soul, a controller of the flesh, and a controller of them both. These 3 individuals arise to lead their people in each generation. The Cain population is most vast, with about 8 out of 10 humans being born falling in that category. The next is the Seth population, at about 1.9999 out of every 10 humans born. The Abel is about 0.000001 out of 10 people. The catalyst of these 3 people is special, because they are the ones who will decide the fate of each generation."
His words were starting to become evident as he continued. "What do you mean?" I pressed.
"Do you know of the 2 witnesses of Revelations?" he replied.
I shook my head no once more.
"And I will give power to my 2 witnesses, and they will be clothed in burlap, and will prophesy during those 1,260 days. These 2 prophets are the 2 olive trees, and the 2 lampstands that stand before the Lord of all the earth. If anyone tries to harm them, fire flashes from their mouths and consumes their enemies. This is how anyone who tries to harm them must die. They have power to shut the sky, so that no rain will fall for as long as they prophesy. And they have the power to turn the rivers and oceans into blood, and to strike the earth with every kind of plague as often as they wish. When they complete their testimony, the beast that comes up out of the bottomless pit will declare war against them, and he will conquer them and kill them," he continued. "These 2 men are the one chance of hope. The children of Seth have been taken. They are the pre-rapture Christians. What's left over, or more specifically, the people you and your legion are battling for, those people are the children of Cain that will choose Father Yahweh over Lucifer. These men are going to be the final sacrifice for these witnesses."
"So, who are these witnesses?" I asked empathetically. He looked me in the eyes with an unnervingly weird stare.
"Enoch and Elijah," he replied with a woeful sigh.
His words were relieving as I exhaled, happy to hear. "Well, where are they?" I replied. "And I thought you said there were 3.
"There are, but understand, just as the Christ has his witnesses, so does the Antichrist," he replied. "He exercises all the authority of the first beast in his presence, and he makes the earth and those who dwell in it to worship the first beast, whose fatal wound was healed. He performs great signs, so that he even makes fire come down out of heaven to the earth in the presence of men. And he deceives those who dwell on the earth because of the signs which it was given him to perform in the presence of the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image to the beast who had the wound of the sword and has come to life." As he finished his words, an eerie feeling filled me. The energy was toxic, and it overtook me quickly as I fell to my knees. A voice echoed, catching my attention as Michael turned to me, signaling for me to keep quiet. "Funny running into you here,"
said a man with long black hair. It was obvious he was an angel, but the way he was acting threw me. His mannerisms and the way he walked was different. Outside of Michael, the majority of the angels were robotic in their mannerism, but this guy was different. Michael signaled for me to follow him via BAU as he turned to leave without saying a word.
"Brother, Michael, not even a chastisement for old time's sake?" he replied in a mocking tone.
Michael cut his eyes as we walked past the angel. I snuck by him, getting the impression he couldn't see me as he never even turned in my direction. Michael's warning made it abundantly clear that I was invisible. I just had to be quiet. It was obvious Michael was trying to smuggle me out without this guy knowing, and I figured it would be smarter to follow his lead and ask questions later.
"I hear you guys have picked the Legion to stop me,"
he replied, stopping me and Michael in our tracks. I hear they're getting their butts kicked so far in the Light Guard trials, and after all the hoopla too. But what can I say about a legion you put together? Why are you here? Semyaza shot angrily. He gave Semyaza a cynical glare, then replied, Oh, I was just trying to let you know we got the old gang back together. All your children are back with dear old mommy, he continued. As much as I know you hate hearing about my current beau and your ex-wife Diana, I just had to share the good news. So that's all. I can see I'm not wanted here, so I'll make myself scarce. But I'll definitely give your family your regards. He winked at Michael as he created a wormhole and stepped through it. As he disappeared, the guard closed the cell door as Semyaza approached the bars. Michael, be sure to let my friend know that the story I told him is very important. He should find these people. His future depends on it, he replied. Tell him it's all in the Nephilim Testament. I turned to Michael, who was nodding as we were enveloped in light. I didn't even blink, and I was standing in the middle of my room. Michael, what was he talking about? I asked, turning to him. And who was that guy? He shook his head emphatically. It was too risky to go there. I knew I shouldn't have, he barked to himself. Michael? I pressed. Tim, my job is to make sure you're trained. I can't intervene beyond those parameters. That is why I took you to Semyaza. There are things about your world you need to know that I can't tell you. But I shouldn't have taken that chance. It was too risky. That man was an angel, as I'm sure you could tell. Lucifer. It was Lucifer. My eyes almost jumped out of my head. You had me in the same room as the devil? I shot angrily. He raised his hand in an apologetic manner. Unfortunately, yes, he continued. You and your legion need to know this stuff. You have forever to learn the heaven realm, but your obligation is the earth realm. There are factors here that you need to understand that I can't tell you, because it falls out of the laws set up to protect you. I'm only able to help you in matters of training. The rest is in the Word. Can't I just do like a BAU upload or something? I shot. No, the Bible is not heaven realm law. It's earth realm law. It isn't here, he replied, reaching into his bag. Here, take this. Use your teammates to decipher the message Semyaza gave you, and seriously think about what you learned tonight, all right? I nodded as he walked over and placed his hand on my head like my father used to do. I started to object and tell him I wasn't a little kid, but there was something wrong about saying that to a guy who's a couple 100,000 years older than you that seemed to cause an argument to lose its validity. I'm sorry. I wish I could stick around and help you sort this stuff out, but as I said, I only get a small amount of time to interact with you. I have to go, but seriously, Tim, take care, and I'm rooting for you, okay, kid? He continued with a smile as he disappeared. I went to fall on the bed, but before I could, I heard a knock on my door. Hey Tim, Jacob is ready to train! Screamed Sam from the other side of the door. Through all the commotion, I had almost forgotten Jacob. I sighed and peeled myself off the bed. It was like the knowledge of the history of our world was a heavy burden that was weighing me down. Like with everything that had been heaped on me before, I forced it to the back of my mind, struggled to my feet, and kept it moving. Yeah, I'm coming.